Good evening. My name is Lisbee Stainton. I am the Associate Dean for Programs here at LCCM. I'm also a professional songwriter and artist, and I have been teaching songwriting, songcraft, lyricism, narrative form for just over 10 years. And in that time, I have watched something rather uncomfortable happening in the arts. And that is that the arts themselves, being able to practice in the arts, being able to access arts education, have become more precarious, more privileged, and more shaped by those who can afford to take the time, the risk, and the debt. So the question that generally has plagued me for some years looks a bit like this. How do we build learning spaces in the arts that are not just about output or industry readiness, but about relational safety and growing through and maintaining connection with others? Because creativity does not exist in a vacuum. We do actually need each other to make it. And that brilliant piece of music we just saw is the perfect example of that. So I began to find my answer to this question in a very unromantic place. And that was on a Zoom screen surrounded by little blank squares in March 2020, and there's me at the top there. Now, before, little did I know, actually, that in that Zoom room, I would really begin to perceive the answer to my question in a completely different way. Now, before the pandemic started, I was teaching in person a level 5 or second year module to songwriters called Creative Processes that was quite simply about songwriting technique, about lyricism, narrative form, and every few weeks, my students and I would hold a peer feedback session where students would bring in unfinished work or work in progress, and we would do feedback. They would give and receive feedback. Now, when I first started teaching on that module, I noticed something really important. Feedback didn't exist in that module. What students thought was feedback was actually praise, which is lovely, but that isn't developmental at all. They also didn't have the confidence to bring in unfinished work to show each other. So, of course, every piece of work they brought in wasn't there to get developmental feedback because it was finished. So I developed over several years a strategy, a peer feedback strategy in that classroom to help my students learn how to give focused, specific developmental feedback, whilst also hopefully giving them the confidence to take the risk to bring in work in progress, unfinished work. And here's what my strategy looks like in a nutshell. First of all, very simply, I removed the rows of chairs in the classroom and turned it into a circle. And then I joined my students in that circle, and it became a group setting rather than a hierarchy. The second thing I did is I introduced, and you'll enjoy my little pictures here, I introduced a simple feedback strategy called medal and mission. You would give someone a medal for something they did well and a mission for something they could develop. The last thing I did was I wanted to avoid general feedback. So I introduced specific feedback roles where students would work together in pairs given a feedback role. So that role might be lyrics, harmony, melody, and they would listen, the two of them, have a little chat, and then give their feedback together. Now, over the time that we did this, it went really well. So feedback slowly but surely became more developmental, more focused, more specific, and I noticed students get more confident in bringing in unfinished work. And I was really pleased because I thought, brilliant, I've cracked peer feedback as a learning and teaching strategy. And then everything went online. I chose that photo, just to say, to put it there. And I found myself in a Zoom room with 25 to 35 students, cameras off, patchy Wi-Fi, long, drawn-out silences. And I did what most educators did, given the speed of the transition that we had to go from in-person to online. I simply tried to run my next peer feedback session exactly as I would have done in person, just on a screen. Now, for those of you who learned or taught during COVID and were online, you might be able to guess how well that went. Really badly. The first peer feedback session was excruciatingly painful. We got through maybe 2 pieces of work in 90 minutes, and the conversation was stilted, and the usual social cues that we would expect in a session like that just ceased to exist. And at the end of the day, when I was looking a lot like this terrible picture of me on this slide, my email inbox began to fill up, and it began to fill up with student feedback about how the feedback session had gone. And this is an example of some of that feedback. Yes, quite. We were forced to sit through it, which became tedious. There must be a simpler way. Yeah, they were absolutely right. It was terrible. I was devastated. Not that my students were right, but that I had gotten it so wrong. As a professional songwriter, the work I've always been most proud of has been when I felt safe with my collaborators to take a risk and to develop that work with them so it pays off. And as an educator, I've always tried to have that same environment instilled in my classroom. But here I was now in my own classroom, be it on Zoom, and the strategy that I had carefully built to build that community had done the exact opposite. It had shut it down. And I was what in action research terms, I'd become a living contradiction. My values were being denied in my practice. So I did something slightly radical for a teacher. I stopped pretending I knew what to do, and I asked my students to help me fix it. So I took all of their feedback that they had very kindly sent me, and I created a poll. And then I presented that poll to them in the next lesson, proposing different ways that we might approach our next online peer feedback session. And this was the poll. I gave them a number of different options, different ways of approaching feedback, and I introduced a virtual learning space for them to asynchronously, outside of timetabled lesson, post work and still get feedback. And I also proposed the use of breakout rooms on Zoom, either with student groups or I'd bring an external guest to sit in each room and give feedback. And the majority of my students chose option 1. Short focused feedback, and then posting through the week on the virtual learning space to still give and receive feedback to each other and get it from me as well. Now, I could have taken this as just a sort of customer satisfaction survey, but instead I took it for what it was. It was my students telling me how they needed peer feedback to work for them in this new and unfamiliar environment. And what they were telling me was that my students wanted to stay together and be heard. So off the back of that information, I made 3 key changes to our next peer feedback online session. Firstly, we kept low general feedback as a rule, but we removed the idea of roles. Instead, the onus was on the person presenting to ask for specific feedback. What did they want feedback on? What did they want to develop? And we would give them feedback based on that. The absence of roles and pair work in a screen meant that we could keep medal and mission, but it sped up. We got through much more in each lesson. And lastly, I introduced an asynchronous virtual learning platform, and students did post during the week. So what happened in that first session? Well, we got through maybe 3 times as much work as we had done in the previous session. 6 to 9 pieces of student work. And those students who didn't want to or couldn't play in the session did post during the week and get feedback from each other. And after that session, I tried to get feedback from them about that feedback session. So I gave them a questionnaire with a template that was designed by a man called Stephen Brookfield, and it's called a critical incident questionnaire. And the design of that template is simply a way of getting feedback from your students and then presenting it back to them. And in that questionnaire, I asked my students, when in that session did you feel most surprised, most supported, and most engaged? And here is a few examples of their actual feedback that they gave me. On the whole, students felt most engaged when they were giving or receiving feedback and when they were listening to each other's work. And they all described the class as a supportive space. Now that's important. That's really good information for me, because that told me that my students weren't just perceiving feedback as a way to improve their songcraft, but they were telling me that it was also a way for them to stay connected during an isolated time. And that's when I realized the feedback done well is community infrastructure. I had been treating feedback as information when what my students needed was to treat feedback as relationship. So once I thought that model works, I began to try and perfect it further. And I asked a slightly different question. What can peer feedback do in an online space that it can't as easily do in person? And one of the biggest issues at the time, and you may recall this, was cameras, or them not being on. Now, I began doing some research, and research done by Alexandra Sousa at Indiana University showed us that students' ability to engage in online learning was often limited by access to technology, unreliable Wi-Fi connections, and just the sheer strangeness of the medium. And this particularly affects students who are more anxious, introverted, or neurodiverse. So there really was no point in me just forcing cameras on, because it would just make my students more anxious, more stressed. So I did something very straightforward. I simply made cameras optional. And at the beginning of a lesson, I asked students to privately message me in the chat panel and say whether they couldn't turn their camera on. And then I would treat that as a baseline for attendance and for trust. But from that very small motion came something absolutely fascinating. The chat panel came to life. And suddenly students were posting more written feedback than they were speaking it. This is actual chat from my sessions, by the way. I did take out the names, just so you know. They were posting these waves of enthusiasm and encouragement onto the chat. And my job changed. So I was no longer just facilitating the spoken conversation, I was also managing the written one as well. And I would read out the comments as they came through, giving those students an audible voice in the session. And ultimately, when you give students multiple ways to participate, it improves that sense of inclusion in the room. Online learning is often framed as less than in-person learning, but here it gave us more ways to connect. And it was particularly powerful for those students who perhaps usually struggled to find their voice in a physical setting. And for them, the online environment became an advantage because they had options. So suddenly they had options to write their feedback instead of speak it. They had options to post their work later instead of pressured to play it now. They had options to bring in pre-recorded demos instead of playing live. And that was another small shift I noticed. More and more students were bringing pre-recorded work, which might seem like a really obvious thing given the medium that we were working with, but a hugely important thing was happening. By bringing in pre-recorded work, students were able to control how their work was heard more, and it removed some of that perceived risk of failure for them as well. And then something happened by the end of the year that I genuinely couldn't have predicted, particularly considering the horrendous way we started. If you had told me, I would have told you to get in the seat. But by the end of the year, some students began coming to sessions not to play their work at all, but only to give feedback, which is wild. Peer learning researcher Keith Topping tells us that giving feedback actually enhances self-assessment and metacognition. So when we help others, we're actually helping ourselves understand how we learn more deeply. And I was watching that happen in real time as my students clearly recognized the value of their own development in those sessions. And I watched their focus shift from when is it my turn to I'm here to support others. And in a year where we were all very isolated, that little shift from self-protection to mutual care felt like a small miracle. Now, at the end of that year, obviously, that cohort of students progressed onto their next year of study. And in theory, my research project ended there, but my learning did not. And today, as the Associate Dean for Programs here at LCCM, I carry my curiosity and my genuine enthusiasm about the power of peer feedback into the work that we do, into the programs we run, the programs we design, and the teams that I work with and lead. And these are the questions that I ask. Where do students practice seeing and being seen through feedback, not just receiving marks? How many legitimate ways have we given them to participate, particularly for those students who perhaps don't perceive themselves as belonging in higher education? How are we involving them in shaping these peer feedback spaces instead of just designing everything for them and then wondering why they disengage? Because the world our students are stepping into is very, very strange. They are constantly measured, be it through algorithms, likes, followers, view counts, but they are very rarely deeply seen. And in the arts, this culture of metrics meets precarity, where peers become competitors and creativity becomes content. And without careful design, feedback is not automatic. It either disappears completely or becomes, frankly, brittle. And in the research project I did with my students, what we discovered is that with structured peer feedback, we could together turn attention into a shared resource. Every time we sat down in a circle, be it metaphorically or physically, and we gave and received considered, supportive, caring feedback, and we asked questions of each other's work, and then we chose to come back again and do it again, we were redistributing something really important: time, attention, and belief. Now, these are invisible resources, but they matter hugely to someone who might not have had their creativity taken seriously before. So, Michael Moore's theory of transactional distance states that the quality of learning is not dictated by how close you are to someone. It's dictated by the structure of the course and the interactions that take place within it. And research building on this by people like Credence Baker show us that an instructor's immediacy and presence online can have a huge impact on students' emotional connection and motivation in a course. So physical proximity is not the same as connection. And I am not arguing against in-person learning here at all, not in the slightest. What I'm arguing for is to design learning as if connection is the point. Because ultimately, every time we carefully build an effective feedback space, we are building the kinds of relationships that help us survive in difficult times. Now, my question to you is this. In your work, in your studies, in your families, in your communities, ask yourself these questions. What do my feedback spaces look like? Are they places of performance and judgment, or are they places of belonging where people can risk being unfinished? Because whilst I cannot fix the arts overnight, sorry, I don't have a magic wand, what we can do is we can choose to build spaces where feedback is not a weapon or a grade, but a way of saying, I see you, I'm with you, let's work on this together. And when we do that, it looks a lot like learning as connection. And if we do it well, it also looks a lot like growing together collectively. And with that, I welcome any feedback on my talk. Thank you very much.